Welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm Elizabeth Benyon, Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of Community Engagement and the American Democracy Project at Indiana University, South Bend. With just under 2 weeks until Election Day, the final push is on in the 2024 general election. This week, we're talking to Michigan reporters about the major races that will shape the future of the state. We'll discuss the presidential race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, as well as the highly competitive U.S. Senate race between Democrat Alyssa Slotkin and Republican Mike Rogers. Joining us today are Lauren Gibbons, political reporter for Bridge, Michigan, and Chad Livengood, politics editor for the Detroit News. Chad, let's start with you. With just under 2 weeks left until Election Day, how are the Trump and Harris campaigns positioning themselves in Michigan? And what strategies are they using to try to sway undecided voters?
Well, you would be hard pressed to find an undecided voter. Most polling shows there is fewer than 1%. Our most recent Detroit News WDIV poll shows it's about 0.7% undecided voters. So you'd have to go, really rummage for that needle in the haystack to find the undecided. Now it is purely a turnout game, and they are going to places where they know they need to do well, and if anything, they need to run up the score. So Saturday, Kamala Harris is going to be campaigning at a rally in Kalamazoo, and trying to utilize a college town, Western Michigan University, with some special help from former First Lady Michelle Obama. Donald Trump is holding a rally Friday night in Traverse City. Traverse City itself is kind of a pretty little blue dot on the map now, but around it is Rock Rib Republican territory, and his appeal to low propensity, particularly male voters in rural areas, is a big part of his strategy to counter Kamala Harris in the suburbs of Detroit and Grand Rapids. And then on Saturday, Trump is going to one of the suburbs of Detroit, Novi, for a rally up in Oakland County, where Harris, her chances of winning this really hinge on really turning out a lot of voters and running up the score in Oakland County and Kent County around Grand Rapids.
Lauren, who are those key voters then that Kamala Harris needs to win? And conversely, for Donald Trump, is it mostly blue collar white men, or which groups are you seeing these candidates really try to appeal to in terms of that turnout game?
Yeah, especially when it comes to areas like Oakland and Kent County, you're looking at suburban voters. In 2020, Joe Biden won with a lot of help from, well-educated suburban area voters who were coming in and, have generally leaned Republican in the past and are now, at least in the past few election cycles, have broken for Democrats. And so Harris is really trying to appeal to those voters, certainly now in West Michigan, but she's spent a lot of time here in Metro Detroit. So that would be one group that I'm obviously watching, as certainly, the blue collar voters you've mentioned, that's been a theme throughout the last several election cycles. Certainly that's an important target for Trump. That was kind of his marquee voter back in the 2016 cycle. And in Michigan, after losing it in 2020, he's certainly really trying to get that back. So that would be an area. And also very interesting, in a lot of recent polling, we've seen a pretty significant gender gap with women largely breaking for Harris and men largely breaking for Trump. And I think both candidates have a lot of work to do to convince, well, one, Trump with women and Harris with men, to try and even the score a little bit in among gender gaps as well.
Now, do we know if that gender gap exists across racial lines, or is that mostly women of color, white women who often have voted in the past more for Trump actually than for Biden, or the Democratic candidate also leaning toward Harris?
Harris has been making a push in recent weeks among Black men. I think that's a constituency that they're pretty interested in, convincing, and are a little worried. I think that they might not be quite that they not might not quite come out in the numbers they have for previous Democratic candidates. So I think that's an area. But yeah, in terms of women, there's not a whole ton of difference between women of color and white women. It and Chad, you might be able to speak to the recent like Detroit News poll, but it seems as though it's been a pretty significant majority across the board.
Yeah, in most of our recent polling, Harris is running 15 and 20 points above Trump overall in women. But then when you start looking at non-college educated white women, that there is a much closer margin between these two candidates. And in many cases, in many places of the state, Trump wins that segment of female voters. And this is what we saw in 2016 when we started seeing exit polling on election night, and they were showing Trump winning white non-college educated women by 20 points. It was essentially a sort of a Brexit-like outcome, where rural and even blue collar, suburban blue collar areas were coming home for Trump and rejecting the Democratic candidate on the ballot, and a female Democratic candidate, and nonetheless. And so this is something we're going to watch for in the final week. Donald Trump has done really well in Macomb County, the northern suburb of Detroit, that's more blue collar, where his auto industry message is really honed in on his railing against electric vehicles. This is an area that this really speaks to folks. Also, downriver, Wayne County, this sort of working class suburbs, majority white suburbs southwest of Detroit. This is an area also that is kind of what I call a battleground within the battleground. There are a couple of state house races that they're really hinging on how well Trump does, at least hinging for Republicans. Same thing in Macomb, and there's a sort of a swath of central Macomb and central Oakland County where Republicans see their best chances of picking up seats and flipping control of a state house that's controlled by Democrats, 56 to 54 right now.
And Lauren, in terms of Black men, you mentioned there was some concern in the Harris campaign that they might not turn out and vote. It seems like that may be what animated Barack Obama to speak directly to this group and say, hey, don't stay home because you have a woman candidate.
Yeah, certainly. And that's been happening across the country, but we have seen it in Michigan too. It's definitely a situation that Democrats are trying to avoid. As Chad mentioned earlier, turnout is a major factor of all of this. So they really need a big turnout in Detroit to buffer some of those areas that might lean the other way. And speaking of Democrats, of course, in the Metro Detroit area. And so in addition to, appealing to some of those suburban voters we talked about earlier, they really need to make sure that voters in Detroit are animated and excited. And it seems as though they haven't, they're not quite comfortable yet with the numbers they're seeing there. So they're definitely making direct appeals. Harris has gone on several radio shows that are pretty popular in Metro Detroit, like the Breakfast Club. She's been making pretty direct appeals to that subset of voters.
Yeah, to that point, one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters in the African American community is former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, who he essentially sprung from prison on his last day in office by commuting his sentence for his 20-year sentence for corruption in City Hall. And Kilpatrick is out working various networks. He's done radio ads for Trump that are on black radio stations, and so the fear here is that it's a little soft, the support, compared to Joe Biden just 4 years ago. And in a race that could come down to tens of thousands of votes, this could be one of the areas on the margins. And the other thing that Trump is trying to do is he's trying to take advantage of the downright crisis the Democrats have with their Arab American constituency when it comes to Biden and Harris's support of Israel, support of arms for Israel in the conflict against Gaza. The 300,000 or more people in Southeast Michigan of Arab and North African descent. Many of them have family in Palestine or Lebanon, and they live in mostly clustered in Dearborn, Hamtramck, Dearborn Heights, but some other they are spread everywhere around the Metro Detroit region, and this is a real big looming fear, particularly as Trump just got the endorsements of the Hamtramck and Dearborn Heights mayor. He went to Hamtramck last week. They sprung up a campaign office for him just to have this event, it seems, and so they are trying to see if they can at least play some little bit of offense here. And nothing that Harris has said has gotten this uncommitted movement to move off of their opposition to her. At the same time, they're not endorsing Trump, or they say they're going to go out and try to work against Trump. And one of the main leaders of this is U.S. Rep. Rashida Tlaib, who prominent Democrat from Detroit, has not said who she's voting for president, which is something that I think looms over the Harris campaign.
And so when we're talking about support for Israel, clearly this is not really a call to vote for Trump, but it sounds like more like a call to either skip the presidential race or vote third party or sit at home and just not necessarily cast that vote for Harris, or at least make that the real threat.
If you look at 2016, Donald Trump won the state by 10,704 votes. And there was a nexus of 230,000 people who didn't vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. Gary Johnson got a couple percentage points, and Jill Stein got a percentage point, and there was tens of thousands of people who didn't fill in the bubble for president between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And that scenario does feel like it could replay itself on November 5th.
Now, Chad, Donald Trump recently made negative comments about Detroit, calling it just horrible, claiming that the city's never fully come back. How, if at all, these remarks impact Detroit voters? It sounds like it hasn't discouraged the mayor.
Yeah, well, there's kind of the political class in Detroit that got all indignant and upset about it, and that is led by, let's just be honest, the white mayor, and he said this in front of the largely white business leaders, the Detroit Economic Club, but there is a different perception of Detroit for those who live there. And this is what Trump is kind of trying to play on a little bit, to speaking to these black men and saying, this comeback that's is seen in this what is known as the 7.2, which is essentially greater downtown 7.2 square miles out of 137 square miles of a city. Some Detroiters feel left behind by the comeback, the sort of post-bankruptcy from 10 years ago comeback narrative. It doesn't fit their daily life. And I think Trump was playing to that. And so, yes, you had a lot of the political class and media was getting sort of a little bit indignant about Trump's trashing of the city. But there is a segment of voters that appeals to.
Now, Lauren, former Michigan Congressman Fred Upton recently endorsed Kamala Harris and shared a stage with Republican Liz Cheney in Michigan. Could these high-profile Republican endorsements sway traditionally Republican voters who are hesitant about Trump? Do you hear stories from voters? Are we seeing any evidence that these appeals might work?
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the Harris campaign seek out and promote these Republican endorsements. Typically, they've come from more moderate Republicans who were longtime Trump critics, so I'm not necessarily surprised by a lot of the names that have come out there. In terms of whether it'll sway voters, I don't think it'll sway voters who have already committed to Trump and like Trump. It may sway some of those people on the margins who, have previously been a little conservative, but not loved the Trump presidency. So I don't know if that necessarily makes a difference, but here in Michigan, anything could make a difference, and
Every
so they're
vote
really
counts.
appealing. They're really appealing to every voter that they can, and especially coming from someone like Fred Upton, who was really well liked in his district. He was known as kind of someone who could work with both sides of the aisle. It doesn't hurt. Will it necessarily sway every Republican? No.
Now
Yeah.
let's turn to that Senate race. Chad, the Michigan Senate race between Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers is very closely watched, not just in Michigan, but nationally. Do you believe the outcome of this Senate race will mirror the results of the presidential election, or could we see a Slotkin win even if Trump carries Michigan?
In most polls, Slotkin has been running several points ahead of Harris, and so two or three or four, they all kind of a little bit vary, but she is still ahead of the top of the ticket, and so yeah, it does seem completely plausible that Trump pulls out ekes out a victory like he did in 2016, and the Democratic Senate candidate wins. That will, depend. And we have three really hot, competitive U.S. House races in Michigan that also could swing the balance of power in the House. And so those battlegrounds kind of play into the turnout factors for both president and Senate as well. And so, but Mike Rogers, the Republican, has been on the ascent, and largely because at the end of August, he was running in our late August poll. He had like 72% of Trump voters. In our most recent poll, he was capturing about 86% of them. And so he's had to just basically reintroduce himself. He had been a congressman for many years, but sort of left the state or had been kind of an sort of absent political player for 10 years, basically. And so a lot of this has been hinged on trying to reintroduce him to persuadable or Republican leaning or independent voters, and just there. I think the Mitch McConnell's super PAC has thrown about $33 million into this race just in the last 30 days, and that's noticeable. I mean, I can't tell you how many pieces of mail I have, and I live in Livingston County, which is a Republican area, but in middle of that seventh district, swing district for Congress. So I know I'm right in the thick of things here, getting highly targeted for votes both in that seventh district race and also in that Senate race.
Yeah, so Lauren, there were a couple of debates between Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers. Did that produce any movement, or do you think it really is these ad blitzes? Is it hard to tell in terms of the timing of the polls, in terms of voter discussions, and is it still a toss-up in your view that we don't know who will win?
Yeah, the debates were really interesting. I was at both of them. It was interesting to hear them go at each other. From a strictly resume perspective, both Slotkin and Rogers have a national security background. They have congressional experience, and they've been known as bipartisan operators to some extent in Congress. And so, on paper, these are pretty similar candidates. Obviously, in those ads and in all of this messaging that voters are getting, they are very much trying to differentiate themselves. And so I do think the millions and millions of dollars that have been spent on television, mailers, all of the social media ads will probably have some impact. But clearly both parties are considering this a pretty toss-up state. Slotkin has been raising millions of dollars since she got into the race. Mike Rogers has recently seen that boost that we just discussed. It's going to come down to the wire. I think a lot of it does depend on the top of the ticket, but certainly both candidates have a path.
One of the factors and fault lines of this Senate race is abortion and whether Democrats can use abortion to their advantage politically, even though we as a state of Michigan adopted a constitutional amendment protecting a woman's right to abortion and reproductive decisions 2 years ago. They are using this pretty heavily in the Senate race and every race on down, practically the county commission races. But this one, they're just using Mike Rogers' record on being very, very anti-abortion while he was in Congress. And Mike Rogers is saying, I'm not going to do anything if I get elected to this. I'm going to respect the will of the voters. And every Republican from Rogers on down the ballot is taking the same line to try to thwart these attacks that are coming. And we're seeing it heavily in television ads for the battle for the state house and also those U.S. House races. So this is going to be kind of the first test about whether this is the wedge issue that can always be pulled out to thwart a Republican insurgency on election day.
It's quite interesting, isn't it, that under Roe, the voters who were most animated by the issue of abortion seem to be the pro-life, anti-abortion voters. And now that Roe is overturned and the rights are less secure, states are making the decisions, this has become an issue that Democrats are trying to use to really become that single issue that might, or at least the final tipping point for a voter.
Yeah, absolutely. And here in Michigan, in 2022, there was that huge push, and that certainly benefited Democrats. Now, if Democrats can, repeat that magic in 2024, they're hoping to. And you've heard that, especially, in some of these in the Senate debate. Most recently, Elissa Slotkin looked at the camera and basically told voters not to trust Mike Rogers on abortion issues. Now, he said that he will respect the will of Michigan voters now that it's been decided and put in the Constitution. But Elissa Slotkin and other Democratic candidates are saying if Republicans win, that goes out the window. So it is an interesting issue, and it will be very interesting to see what happens when there is not an active ballot initiative related to abortion on Michigan's ballot.
And Chad, Michigan has a strong tradition of union influence, but we've seen a lot of diversity within unions in terms of how their members are thinking and voting. How are labor unions and their members reacting to the candidates? And could their stance influence outcomes in the presidential race, but also the state house, the Senate race, et cetera?
Yeah, so you see the union leadership coming out and strongly promoting Kamala Harris and for the presidency. Even the Michigan Teamsters, they as a state union broke with the national union and did endorse Harris, while the national union decided to sit this one out. And Shawn Fain, the United Auto Workers president, is becoming major surrogate for Harris. But Trump, this is where the Trump magic, you're not really sure if it's real or if it's going to actually materialize, but he is trying to play to their members every day, particularly in his message about EVs and saying, hey, if we transition to EVs, you all who work in engine plants and component plants that make pieces and parts that go into engines, the gas engines, you're going to lose your jobs. And I mean, this is Trump messaging up and down the I-75 corridor between Detroit and Oakland County and Macomb County, and then you go up into Flint and Saginaw, Bay City. Saginaw County is like one to watch on election night. It has been a bellwether in Michigan presidential elections in this century, essentially. And if Trump wins it like he did in 2016, seems like he might have a chance of pulling out a victory.
Well, we'll be watching that along with Democrats' narrow 2-seat majority in the Michigan House of Representatives. So much more to discuss, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this week's Politically Speaking. So I want to thank our guests, Lauren Gibbons of Bridge, Michigan, and Chad Livengood of the Detroit News for joining us today to share their insights on the 2024 election and the races shaping Michigan's political landscape. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, reminding you that it takes all of us to make democracy work. We'll see you next time.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.